Materials supplied by Microsoft Corporation may be used for internal review, analysis, or research only. Any editing, reproduction, publication, rebroadcast, public showing, internet, or public display is forbidden and may violate copyright law.
Thank you for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm here to welcome Alec Foge to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Alec is here today to discuss his book, The Tinkerers, the amateurs, DIYers, and the inventors who make America great. The U.S. has been a nation of tinkerers from its very founding. Lately, the country seems to be changing from a land of doers to one of consumers. And the once praised innovative aura seems to have fallen aside to corporate goals. Industry can learn a lot from the history of the pure tinkering mindset and better understand how to recapture its remarkable power. Alec Foge is the author of Right of the Dial, Confusion is Next, and The Empire God Built. A former Rolling Stone contributing editor and People magazine senior writer, he has also written for the New York Times, Details, Vogue, and many other publications. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. First, I want to just say thanks for having me here at Microsoft. As a company that was obviously built on tinkering, it's a real honor to be here, and it's really the perfect place, I think, to talk a little bit about the history of tinkering in the United States and the future of tinkering, which I believe I wrote this book sort of to explore the American tinkering spirit. And the original idea for the book came out of the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. At that time, a lot of white-collar workers were losing their jobs in this country. And there was a lot of hand-wringing going on, I guess, in terms of people wondering what they did and what they made. You would read a lot in the press about people who had these big, high-powered jobs, and they would go and then and try to find something to do with their hands. And a lot of people began wondering, the United States used to be this great manufacturing hub, and these days, did we still make things anymore? And did that matter if we didn't? Did it matter that we had become primarily a service economy as opposed to a manufacturing economy? There were also a lot of people talking around that time about whether the United States could still compete with China and with India and with other countries around the world that are really obviously doing their own innovation and doing it quite well. So I thought about that a little bit, and that was kind of the origin for the idea for the book. I think first I want to talk a little bit about tinkering as I define it in the book, because obviously there are all sorts of definitions for it. And most of them I found when I first started looking into the word for using as a title was that most of them were pejorative. I mean, the idea traditionally was that the tinkerers were kind of crackpots, people who sort of puttered around in the basement. And they never really got anywhere, and they never really did anything. They weren't serious about their pursuits. But I don't think that was always true, and I think it kind of evolved that way for a variety of reasons that I'm going to discuss this afternoon. But there's this notion of that we need to sort of have this creative space, particularly in corporate America today, where these new ideas, these forward-thinking ideas can happen so that we can maintain our competitiveness worldwide. And so I think I needed to acknowledge kind of that tinkering was something that that was actually a positive thing. I mean, in the contemporary sense, I learned that we kind of think of tinkerers as specialists, as either trained engineers or people who really, they have a brilliant idea, or they're very well educated in some sort of high-tech pursuit, and therefore they are they are the perfect person to be a tinkerer. But in fact, I think tinkering is much more of a basic, almost innate pursuit. And there are a lot of companies these days that are talking about, well, how do we encourage tinkering? How do we teach our employees to think up new ideas and bring them to the company? But I would argue that everybody is kind of born a tinkerer. The way I define it in my book is that a tinkerer is, in fact, a dilettante. And I mean that in a good way. Tinkerers typically and historically in the United States, tinkerers have been generalists, not necessarily people who were trained in a certain field and therefore were trying to solve a specific problem. In fact, they were kind of passionate individuals who had curiosity about certain topics and pursued them sometimes against all of the odds. So, that was a key aspect of what I wanted to establish in working on the topic. Tinkering, of course, and the reason tinkering is a worldwide pursuit. There's nothing that the United States owns about tinkering, obviously, but there is something intrinsic, I think, to the American spirit that that kind of ties the past to the present to the future, that continues to make the United States a very fertile ground for tinkering. Tinkering is looking at the things around us and thinking about new things that we can make from existing things. I mean, so many of the things that we think of as completely new ideas are usually made of things that already exist. Tinkerers sometimes obviously try to solve problems, but oftentimes they end up solving problems that are completely different from the ones that they set out to solve. So that's okay, though, because it's really, there is a personal journey aspect to it, and I think that because of the history of the United States and because of, there are a number of things that our frontier ethic, kind of our notion of self-reliance, and that understanding of the individual as sort of something worth preserving, I think also comes into play there. I mean, obviously, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, there are all sorts of great examples of team tinkering, but it's really amazing how many ideas have come out of one person saying, well, how about try it this way? As I said before, I think that kids don't need to be taught how to tinker. Obviously, the cliche is tinker toys, but I don't know if anybody's been to one of these maker fairs. They're just these fabulous fairs with all sorts of booths of technologists and scientists and artists and musicians. And I have young kids and took them recently to one of these, and you don't really need to explain what to do. They just go up to things that look interesting and put their hands on them and start trying to do something. I think that some of that's been lost in this country in part because of our educational system and the notion of sort of teaching to the test. And that's something that has, I understand that notion. We want to compete worldwide. We want to make sure that we can tabulate how students are doing. But as everybody in this room probably knows, those skills that you learn about how to do well on a test in school don't really have much value in the real world. Once you get out in the job market, no one's going to ask you to take a test. I start in my book talking about my own little tinkering journey, which started when I sat on my BlackBerry a few years ago. I was getting into the car and I sat on it. I looked at the screen. I almost immediately knew something was wrong. It was, you sort of get this rainbow effect. Can't see anything. I realized pretty quickly that the phone was still working. So I naively took it off to the phone store and asked the salesperson. I said, "Well, can you fix this? It looks like it just needs a new screen." And he said to me, I'd love to fix it. In fact, that used to be my favorite part of the job, but they don't let me do that anymore. Not just specifically him. They didn't let the salespeople do minor fixes on the phones anymore. And so I again naively said, "Oh well, can I get a new one?" And I'm still under contract. And they said, "Yeah, you can get one for $450." And I only had a few more months left on the contract, so I figured, I'm not going to do that. So I took my phone back and went home and did a little Google search, or maybe it was a Bing search, I forget. And pretty quickly I found that a whole series of videos on YouTube mostly that had very detailed instructions on how to take apart your BlackBerry and put a new screen in. In fact, some were specific to my exact model. And so I sent away for a screen online for, I think it was $20. And I got one of these little tool kits, small screwdrivers, and these little plastic pry tools, and followed one of the videos, and within about 5 or 10 minutes had replaced the screen. And for me, I'm reasonably technically savvy, but not especially so. I think the biggest surprise was when I opened the thing up that there were really just about 4 or 5 components. And so this notion that this was something that was way out of my league and that I shouldn't touch this valuable high-tech object was sort of, that idea was completely shattered, because, literally, I unplugged the old screen, I plugged in the new screen. And so for me, that was kind of a galvanizing event in terms of my thinking about the book, because I realized that, we have become this culture that, there's obviously a lot of pressure to get the newest device, and I guess manufacturers also kind of encourage us to not open the devices. We don't want to void the warranty. And but I learned that it was completely possible, I think, that tinkering wasn't all that different from when I was a kid, and that even somebody who didn't have a wealth of knowledge about the device could probably do something with it. Now, if I had turned it into some other wild invention, that would have been even more impressive, I guess. But I was just happy to have my phone back. Now, I mentioned before that there has been this notion of the United States not being a manufacturing hub anymore, and in fact, that's not really true. We make more things than ever in this country, but they're generally on the high-tech side of things. And the other part of that is that fewer human beings are required to make those things, but we still make an awful lot of stuff. And in fact, in the past few years, I think there's been a real movement to bring certain types of manufacturing back onto American shores. So I think that's not something that I think that's definitely a misnomer. And so that started making me think, well, there's a perception problem here about tinkering in the United States, and how we think about innovation and how we think about education as it relates to developing the kinds of minds that are going to create tomorrow's new innovations and new products. So just to refine my definition of what tinkering was, as I mentioned initially, tinkering is not something that requires a specific set of technical skills. There can be a pretty basic, well-rounded notion of knowledge that can allow you to become a tinkerer. And as I mentioned, the traditional idea of tinkering is to sort of take whatever is around and build something new with it. And it's helpful, classic tinkerers kind of know just enough about all sorts of things. They might know a little bit about electronics, they might know a little bit about textiles, or metals, or programming, or paper folding, or cooking, or there can be all sorts of skills that you might need, but you don't know you need until you need them. And I think what's so great about the era that we live in right now is with everything that's online, you can become an expert, or you can fake being an expert pretty quickly. And sometimes that's all that it requires to do really good tinkering. I mentioned before that classic tinkerers pursue their passion, and which simply just means that they might be curious about something. They have an interest in a certain area. They're trying to teach themselves how to do something, and in the course of doing that, all sorts of worlds can open up, and really treat, you can end up treating something very differently from how you originally intended to use it. And this notion of competence becomes very subjective. Right now, I'm going to go a little bit back into history in a minute, but before I do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things you can see in today's culture that show that there is sort of some new seedlings in terms of what's going on in terms of how we're thinking as a country about tinkering. I had mentioned these maker fairs before, and they're just they're only becoming more and more popular. I think that I know this year they have a fair number in cities around the country. And if you haven't been to one, I recommend them. They're a lot of fun, and for both adults and children. And they're kind of, I guess they're a little bit about, they're kind of like the contemporary version of a craft fair, but with, sort of blown up into dimensions that you could never have previously imagined. Another trend that I've noticed is these tech shops that have sprouted up around the country, where you can essentially go in and rent some time and have access to all of the latest devices and tools to experiment with. There was an era not so long ago in this country, probably dating back at least to the early 20th century, and probably a little bit before then, where every good household would have kind of a basement workshop or a tool shop where you would have sort of a general collection of tools that you could pretty much fix anything with. And up until a certain point in the industrial age, that was kind of true. There was almost a finite number of tools you would need to fix practically anything. Obviously that changed over time, and a lot of the tools you might want to play with today are probably wouldn't fit in your basement, or you probably can't afford to put them in your basement. So I think this trend of these tech shops and other workshops around the country have really jumped in, and again, doing very well, and a lot of people are just discovering things about areas of science and technology that they wouldn't have otherwise had access to. I think that there's also a level of whimsy and even humor to tinkering. This photo I like to show was on the site Instructables.com, which was a company co-founded by Saul Griffith, one of the contemporary tinkerers I profile in the book. And the way this project is described on the site is to, the computer mouse is hardware, but you're making it out of wetware, I guess is what they call it. I guess they clean it out, or you're supposed to clean it out before you, I don't know. I haven't tried this one, but you can go on the site and the instructions are there. No animals were harmed in the making of this presentation, though. So now I want to just go back a little bit to early American history. and talk about, at least briefly, Ben Franklin, who obviously was the original American tinkerer. We all learn in school about all of his various inventions, about the kite and the key, and he invented the lightning rod and the Franklin stove and bifocals and the odometer and the harmonium and all sorts of other things. And he was also a source of infinite wisdom with all of his aphorisms. Now he's a great role model for tinkerers, I guess, but the downside of it, I think, is that he became this huge myth, even within his lifetime, as some sort of great man, some genius who came up with just this unimaginable scope of things that changed our lives. I argue in my book that, in fact, his most meaningful tinkering project was really the post office, because, and I make that point just because tinkering is a mindset as much as it is something you do with your hands. And if you want to talk about something that dramatically changed the United States, it was mail service, and and also this ability to affordable mail service, and mail service that you would guarantee to have a letter delivered anywhere. So that's one aspect of it that when I looked at all of Franklin's stuff, it was really the post office that stood out as kind of the biggest and wildest innovation in all ways. Although not to discount electricity, but the other thing I sort of make a point of saying is that Franklin wasn't really the only tinkerer of the founding fathers. In fact, most of them were tinkerers. George Washington, before he became president, was I guess you would call, he was the old-fashioned version of an organic farmer. He was fascinated with the latest cutting-edge farming techniques, and he always wanted to find the best fertilizer and the best way to prevent plant diseases and the best methods for cultivation, and he really was pretty scientific about it. He also had a lifelong passion to build the Potomac Canal. And it's really amazing. Through his whole adult life, until death, this was something that he fanatically pursued, and he tried to hire engineers to come up with a way to build one. The problem was, in the United States at that time, there were no trained engineers yet. So he had to write to England, and the geography in England was obviously much different than it was in the U.S. So the way they eventually came up with doing it didn't make any sense. And in fact, when it eventually was realized, even part of it, the whole thing collapsed. They had it didn't make any sense. And he, again, his lifelong passion. But eventually, there were engineers, and other canals were built based on that work. Thomas Jefferson, obviously, was a huge tinkerer and inventor. He invented the hillside plow, the swivel chair, the macaroni machine. James Madison was also a tinkerer. He invented this walking stick that had a microscope on the bottom, apparently, to look at organisms on the ground. Unfortunately, he was very short, so I think he was about 5 feet tall. So I don't know if that's why it didn't catch on, but and I also, just because I talk about financial tinkering in the book, obviously Alexander Hamilton was a huge financial tinkerer. One of the first contemporary tinkerers that I interviewed and thought about for the book was Dean Kamen. Now, Dean Kamen's quite an interesting guy. He actually got his start as a tinkerer as a teenager. He created these, he used to tinker around with semiconductors and transistors and supertransistors, and created a synchronized music and light device that was fun at parties, and Eventually, actually, he got a job with the Hayden Planetarium in New York to augment their productions. He made his fortune as the inventor of the first drug infusion pump, which now later became known as the Baxter auto syringe, which helps administer insulin to diabetics. And one of his later devices was the walking wheelchair. He had this idea that he was going to help people in wheelchairs be able to get up on curbs and walk up steps so that they wouldn't be too limited. And he came up with this terrifically interesting gyroscopic technology to do that. Of course, what he's best known for is the Segway Transporter, which was actually came out of that same technology, the gyroscopic technology. And if you remember back when the Segway came out, I mean, it was hugely hyped and eventually was talked about as the future of transportation. They predicted it was going to sell millions, and obviously they're still around. Thanks to the movie Paul Blart Mall Cop, it became kind of a running joke. And I mean, you still see, I'm told that in a lot of big warehouses they're used to move back and forth across a large floor. A lot of tour guides use them. They certainly haven't changed or revolutionized transportation as we know it yet. But I think that the reason I liked the story of Dean Kamen is because, there have been all sorts of failures and successes in his career. The point is you don't really know where a lot of these things are ultimately going to end up and how they might impact us as a culture. One of the things that I love that Dean Kamen has done is he came up with the first robotics. It's called the first robotics competition for high schoolers. And around the country, it's just really fascinating. At one event, I sat there for literally an hour watching these basketball-playing robots that some high schoolers had made that they could control with laptops and were amazingly accurate. They could, I mean, literally, they made every basket. But so he's a big thinker these days. He's got his own company in New Hampshire called Decker Research that is coming up with all sorts of new ideas to innovate. But he also believes very strongly in encouraging young people to tinker, regardless of what they ultimately end up doing, with the idea that it's that mindset. It's not necessarily that everybody is going to become an innovator or an entrepreneur or somebody who changes the world, but having more of that active, creative impulse, I think, is valuable to everybody. Going back in history again, I wanted to touch on another archetypal American tinkerer, Thomas Edison. The story that I tell in my book, I tell for a reason, is about Edison's invention. Well, it was of the phonograph. The only problem is that when he first came up with the technology as a young man, he thought that the phonograph was going to be the perfect office dictation machine. And he designed it that way. He marketed it that way. He was convinced this would revolutionize office culture. He was wrong. And in fact, if you read about Edison at length, this was a project that he came back to multiple times over a period of at least 2 decades and could never really get it right. The other thing I like about Thomas Edison is that, again, it's a double-edged sword. It's kind of like with Franklin. With all the interesting and I guess, mind-blowing things he did in his lifetime, he became written about and talked about around the world. And he was also, again, built up into this sort of almost superhero type figure. At the time, people didn't really there were a lot of people who didn't understand how electricity worked. So, when he was dubbed the Wizard of Menlo Park, it was because people actually thought that he was into the occult. I mean, they thought that this really was magic. And so that probably contributed a little bit to this myth. But, if you look at his life and the way that he worked and the lab that he built over time, he failed over and over again. More correctly, all of his assistants failed over and over again. He was the sort of preeminent great man in terms of this notion of tinkering, because he would have all the great ideas, and then he would tell all of his assistants in his lab to figure it out. And he would have all sorts of things. I mean, even look at the development of the light bulb. He wasn't the first person to come up with a light bulb, but through this whole process of him and his assistants and going back and forth and finding just the right materials for the filament, I mean, that whole process was anything but magical. I mean, it was just ridiculous, the amount of hours that they put into over a period of years to figure this out. So I mention that because I think that it demythologizes tinkering a little bit and makes it more, I guess, democratic, because anybody can do the kinds of things that he was doing. I mean, he had the resources after a certain point, and there was certainly a genius-like focus that he had, but it certainly was not easy for him. And so back to the phonograph. I mean, years later, he had tried all different. They had started with cylinders, wax cylinders, and then those had changed to, well, actually, it started with tin cylinders, then to wax cylinders. He was a real skeptic about flat discs. He just thought that was a terrible idea. You lost fidelity, and it didn't make any sense. I should also note that Edison hated music, apparently. And of course, he was pretty much deaf by the time he got older, so it didn't matter. So he never really could fathom the phonograph as an entertainment device, and as a result, never really made any money off of it. And to really, the real injustice in the end was that a company called American Graphophone, which included Alexander Graham Bell as one of its partners, was the company that ultimately was able to make a lot of money off the phonograph as something to listen to music on. So you win some and you lose some, and Edison was no exception. Then I sort of want to jump a little bit, because I think most of what my book is about is from the post-World War II era to the present. And I talk a lot about the difference between physical tinkering and virtual tinkering, and whether that matters or not. Whether they're, because obviously, well, I mean, software development is virtual tinkering. I mean, there's all sorts of work that you can't see, but that goes on to do something like that. So for the more contemporary part of my book, I start by talking about a guy who's really unknown now, and during his lifetime was pretty much a government bureaucrat. So he's not that well known. But this guy Thomas Harris Mcdonald, who came up with the idea for the interstate highway system in this country, and just the idea that an individual basically came up with that idea is kind of counter to what we think of as inventing or tinkering, but I argue that it's sort of a quintessential example of tinkering. McDonald grew up in rural Iowa, And as a kid, he would see how the farmers, how much trouble they had running their wagons and everything over dirt roads. And especially in the spring, it would rain a lot. The roads would get so muddy that, in fact, sometimes they would just go home for a few weeks until everything dried up. And so when he went to agricultural college, and his mentor at Iowa State was a guy who was a big proponent of the Good Roads movement. And what's fascinating about the Good Roads movement in this country was that it was actually intended to increase the use of bicycles. And it started in the late 1800s. So I love the idea that, in fact, modern highways are the result of a movement that was all about bicycles. I mean, people didn't really have cars yet. He eventually became in charge of the roads program in Iowa, and then finally moved to Washington, D.C. to become the head of the Bureau of Public Roads. And all along the way, though, he was trying to figure out, like, what's the problem with highways in this growing nation? You know, and he knew some of the problems from his local experience. One of them was that where the roads went in each state wasn't necessarily germane to where they went to in the country as a whole. Secondly, there was a lot of corruption locally. So it was hard to kind of get roads built properly to last. And so he spent years, once he started in Washington, promoting sound construction practices and sort of, again, kind of promoting the most cutting-edge techniques for road building. And but his big innovation, and this took all of this sort of lifetime, half a lifetime's worth of experience, was that at some point he realized that the highway system was not necessarily a network of roads, but in fact it was a network of organizations, which means that he had to sort of make friends with all these different constituencies and in fact construct a hybrid of federal and state funding to create this network of roads. And the network that he built, or that he advised to be built, its real innovation was that you had to build roads where people were going to go, as opposed to where they already needed to be. And the only way he was able to come to that notion was through this sort of organizational building and communicating with people in this sort of very complex but purposeful this purposeful approach that ultimately created one of the greatest highway systems the world had ever seen. He liked to point out that there were only two other great programs at the time of road building on this level. One was in the Roman Empire under Julius Caesar, and the other one was in Napoleon's France. And but in a lot of respects, the American one was built in a much different way. I think that tinkering and highway building is sort of a good metaphor for what goes on in the brain with tinkering, because it really is a mindset as much as anything else. Because obviously anybody can sit down with a bunch of spare parts, and it doesn't mean they're going to actually do anything with them. You have to sort of have an impulse in your brain to do something with it. And I liked the notion of Thomas Mcdonald as a tinkerer, because externally he just looked like another bureaucrat, but in fact he had this lifelong passion to make something to improve something that he saw as a problem even as a child. So then I jumped forward and sort of try to look at some other types of tinkering, and some of them worked out better than others. One of the obsessions that that this country had, particularly after World War II and as we got into the Cold War era, was to kind of figure out a way to manage the notion of human nature. And the Rand Corporation is probably the best example of that. The Rand Corporation, which was initially funded by the federal government, its initial mission was to codify human behavior in the pursuit of peace. And so they would bring together all sorts of really smart Ivy League types to brainstorm on how they might do that. And one of the first approaches they came up with was game theory. And game theory was the idea that you would apply a mathematical approach to human behavior. The most famous example that is always brought up is the what they used to call the prisoner's dilemma, which is where, and this is sort of a problem you're supposed to solve, and it's a metaphor for the arms race. The police arrest two men for a crime, it might be like stealing a diamond or something. So then they separate them and tell each man if he confesses that he will only do 6 months in prison. But if he, but the prisoner who refuses to confess will get 10 years in prison. And if neither man confesses, then they both get set free, assuming that the diamond is not found. So there was a lot of trying to figure out, well, what was the most probable, how would these parties most probably react? And they kind of scrapped that after a while because they decided there really was no correct answer. That in fact implying mathematics to human behavior maybe didn't make sense. The next project that they set upon was what became known as systems analysis. And systems analysis is the idea that you can try to, rather than trying to solve existing problems, that you can predict future problems and then find solutions to those, and that will help you stay ahead, whether it's in the arm race or anything else in terms of national security. So you would say, like, how many, not that we want to destroy the enemy, but how many enemy factories do we want to destroy? And and sort of take it from there. The end result of that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this was sort of institutionalized tinkering at its youngest level, and it never really came out right in that era. Another example, a couple decades later on, was the Park Corporation at Xerox, which I'm sure a lot of you know the story of. Xerox, its headquarters was in Stamford, Connecticut, on the East Coast, and in Palo Alto they had this R&D site where kind of anything goes, and engineers were encouraged to do whatever they thought was of interest, and they came up with all sorts of great ways to brainstorm and to tinker with ideas. One of my favorite ones was what they used to call Beat the Dealer, which was based on the book by Edward Thorpe on how to play blackjack, but they used it to sort of brainstorm on ideas, and essentially the dealer would have an idea, and it didn't matter, it didn't have to relate to technology or anything, and then everybody else would sit around in beanbag chairs. It was the 70s, and they would essentially try to attack the idea. I mean, of course, this kind of approach is very well known these days, but back then it was kind of revolutionary. And of course, the end result of one of those sessions was the Alto computer, the first personal computer, which famously was misappropriated, or whatever you want to call it, by Steve Jobs to help found Apple. And I think my point in sort of talking about the park corporation is that they had the right idea. They had the idea that you really have to let people, have this anarchical creative space that really let their imaginations run wild and not be beholden to shareholders or to investors. And the problem was that back at corporate in Connecticut, they didn't take it that seriously, and when they finally came up with the notion of the Alto, they just didn't see a market for it. So it didn't matter that Xerox owned Park Corporation. All it took was a young guy to walk in and say, "I know what I can do with that." And so tinkering is not. It's not just having the idea, obviously. Well, now this guy, I'm sure everybody knows who he is. Nathan Myhrvold, Microsoft's first chief technology officer, has done some interesting tinkering things, and I spoke to him for my book. Obviously, more recently, he's been known as the author of the Modernist Cuisine Cookbook and all of the cool food science projects that he's encouraged and been a part of. Carbonated fruit is one of my favorite. But he's done some other things as well that I think he's done a lot of thinking about how to foster contemporary tinkering. The main one is his company called Intellectual Ventures. One of their best known inventions that has come out is the laser bug zapper to help fight malaria. And I believe, I know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has signed on to this project. What's interesting about even that idea was that Nathan told me that the parts used to build the first prototype of this machine were bought off of eBay, and they were just scrapped consumer electronics devices. So I thought that was kind of neat, and that to me is sort of quintessential tinkering. Intellectual Ventures has this interesting idea of, instead of being a venture capital firm, they're actually an invention capital firm, and the idea is that they bring together inventors before they've actually invented things and have them talk about things and try to solve some big problems. And in a lot of cases, allow them still to own those ideas as they develop them, which seems to be a key component in a lot of contemporary tinkering stories that eventually result in real products that succeed. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So Nathan Myhrvold's come up with some really interesting ideas about how to foster tinkering in our contemporary society. There's some other aspects of it that get a little trickier, especially when you're gathering up a lot of patents, which he's gotten some criticism for. But again, it's definitely a fresh idea about it. I want to talk a little bit about financial tinkering. Obviously, most people think of financial tinkering in a negative light based on what happened a few years back. But I think that there is a lot of innovation on Wall Street. The motivations behind it are sometimes suspect, but it's certainly an area that should be considered, I think, in a different way. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in my book is the story of CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, which are typically blamed for the financial crisis of 2008. But what I point out in the book, even though the end result was pretty horrific, was that the folks who created that product initially, it's usually credited to two people, Bill Demchak and Blythe Masters, who were working at JP Morgan at the time, was that they were actually trying to solve a problem. They were looking for a new way to offset certain types of risk, and this seemed like essentially what they did was they bought up all sorts of mortgages and put them in what they call tranches based on the various levels of risk, and then sort of diced them up again and sold them. And the idea, and originally was going to be that there was less risk in this. The problem was there were still real people behind those mortgages, and when they started defaulting, it created all sorts of problems. But that's not to say that there aren't future problems to be solved with the financial tinkering that we haven't thought of yet. And so, I mean, I personally understand the reasons for more regulation in the financial world, but I do sometimes get nervous that sometimes it may go too far, because I think that that's an area, and particularly in the United States, where there are a lot of potential problems that can be solved to the benefit of investors as opposed to the detriment. Another person that I interviewed for the book was, I think I referred to him earlier with the mouse made out of a mouse, is a guy named Saul Griffith. And Saul Griffith, who's a younger tinker, he's in his mid-30s now, he, in a lot of ways, he stands in as kind of my notion of what a contemporary tinkerer can really be. I mean, he's one of the few people I can think of who really qualifies as being a professional inventor. And he's originally from Australia. He came to the U.S. to go to MIT for a PhD, and he's invented all sorts of really interesting things. But he told me that his first tinkering experience was in his parents' house when he was a kid. They were teachers and craftspeople, and he would help his parents reconstruct 17th century looms, which I thought was interesting because it was a good mixture of sort of science and craft. And I think that all the best tinkering actually is sort of a melding of arts and sciences. And a lot of the people that I spoke to for my book pretty much said that. And he went on to do some fascinating things. He invented an eyeglass maker for third world countries, where you could go in and make eyeglasses on demand very cheaply. He did that when he was still in graduate school. He's come up with some fascinating ideas for wind power, a wind turbine that actually floats in the air. It's not grounded to a pole, so it can go up higher and capture much more powerful gusts of wind. He's invented something called elongating rope, which I still don't quite understand, but he's always thinking about stuff, and he also fosters a lot of companies like that Instructables.com that I talked about, and very, very much in the notion of enabling mass tinkering and democratizing it in a way that it really, before the internet, really wasn't possible, but now is eminently possible and makes it open to anybody. I talked to a few people outside of the U.S. For the book because I thought they had some good examples of good ideas about tinkering. One of them was Karl-Heinz Brandenburg, who is best known as the father of the MP3 file technology that started the music file sharing revolution, which helped, I guess, destroy the recording industry. He did this work over many years under the auspices of what's called the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, which is a quasi-public-private partnership where they have government contracts, they have private enterprise contracts. They're minimal teaching requirements, but but he started as a very young man with the mission of trying to figure out how to compress music so you could have high quality music transmitted over a phone line. He ended up with the MP3 technology. Another point to make is that it actually made him a wealthy man because he had his name on a number of the patents, even though they were being developed in a team-like situation. I mean, he was the leader of a lot of the big revelations about how to approach the problem. And obviously the end results were known pretty quickly. And but what's interesting is because he didn't have any additional constraints in terms of what the consequences of that technology were. I think it helped foster it in a way that sometimes, at the time it seemed like it probably wouldn't have been as possible to create that kind of technology in the United States, in part because I think the recording industry was doing everything it could to kind of stop this kind of thing from happening. I talk about a few other ideas about tinkering. Jeannie Gang is an architect in Chicago she's best known for the Aqua building, which has these cool concrete balconies that are all different, create this sort of wave-like effect. But what I talk about is sort of the approach in her office where people work in pairs instead of individually, and she sort of works nearby in a slightly secluded office but kind of hovers around, and there's very much an organic workplace that sort of approximates a kind of team tinkering that I think is really interesting. I also talk about in the book about the guys who came up with Angry Birds in Finland. These guys were young programmers, and they had certain ideas about the game, but in fact they couldn't afford to develop it, so they were taking all these other jobs over a period of years, and they would only work on Angry Birds when they had the time, and so they only did it because they loved doing it. And what's really interesting, I think, is that they never market researched it. They purely based it on what they enjoyed about the game and came up with this crazy idea that, I mean, I don't know, I'm always trying to get my son off of my smartphone to get him off the Angry Birds now so I can play it. But they really took a very different, and I love the idea of tinkering as something that people do when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, because I think that that's where a lot of great tinkering comes out. Another fascinating guy in the book, and one of the last people I want to talk about, is this guy named Gever Tulley out in San Francisco, who has something called the Tinkering School. It started as a summer program, and now there's actually a school called Brightworks, a private school that he co-founded that builds on the idea. Tulley was best known for a TED Talk he did a number of years back called 5 Dangerous Things You Should Let Your Kids Do. On that list were play with fire, own a pocket knife, throw a spear, deconstruct appliances, break the Digital Media Copyright Act, or as an option, he had an option for the last one, drive a car. I don't know, it depends, I guess, which one you think is more dangerous. But his whole idea is to immerse kids from an early age in tinkering and doing things as they learn subjects. So if you're studying physics, do a physics project while you're learning about it. He inspired me to. I realized in the course of this that my 6-year-old son only had toy tools, so I got him a real toolkit, and together we started building a workbench and a toolbox and things like that. And I realized pretty quickly that with a very little instruction, he knew how to use a saw, he knew how to hammer nails, and they learned pretty quickly how to not hurt themselves. So I encourage that kind of tinkering. And again, it's another idea of, how do we, it's not so much teaching kids how to tinker, it's encouraging it because they want to do it. You don't have to explain to them. I didn't have to force my son to learn how to use a saw. He knew he wanted to learn how to use a saw. There are all sorts of other things going on right now that say to me that we're in the early days of a huge tinkering revival. Obviously, one of the best known types of tinkering engines, if you will, are these companies like Kickstarter, and there are a couple are Y Combinator and Techstars that are really coming up with all these different ideas about how to encourage people and essentially crowdsource tinkering, which is something that you could never have done even just a decade ago, to get people to come up with their ideas, post them online. People can weigh in whether they're good ideas or not. They can donate money to help you fund those projects. And in some cases, some of these, there's one called Quirky. I mean, they've gotten projects on the shelves of Target and other big retailers just based on this kind of process. And I think that kind of stuff, and again, I think it's only the early days with a lot of this, I think will really revolutionize the way we think about tinkering and how these stray ideas can turn into really wild projects. I think one thing that that probably everyone's aware of now is what is happening right now is 3D printing. I live in Westport, Connecticut, which has a public library that apparently is on the cutting edge of this kind of thought. They actually have a maker space within the library. And they've also invested recently in buying some 3D printers because in their mind, there's a direct connection between what a library does and the ideas that you can realize with something like a 3D printer. And they've actually had people come in who, just have an idea about something and they can do it up on a CAD program, and then they can come into the library and actually make they're made out of, they're built out of plastic, but they can actually walk out with a 3D version of what they imagined in their head. And just to make that leap in such a elemental form and in such an easy way is just, it's unfathomable in a lot of ways. It's just, it's remarkable. And so I think that, in conclusion, I just want to say that I think that if I haven't made it clear already, my answer to the question of have we lost the American tinkering spirit is no. It's alive and well. But I think there are all certain things there are all sorts of things that we can do to sort of to enhance our sort of home turf advantages. And again, there's different ways in the workplace and different ways in the way we think about education that can help the process. This quote from Alan Kay, I think, is sort of, it's actually kind of profound in a way. Alan Kay was a guy who invented Logo, which was originally intended as a programming language for children. And it was supposed to teach kids how computers actually worked. But that language was the basis for the original software in the Alto at Park. And, again, he was trying to do one thing and ended up being something else. It wasn't realized at Park ultimately, but it provided that framework and that body of ideas that other people could take parts from and build something completely new out of. So I want to thank you for coming today, and I hope this inspires all sorts of tinkering projects in your futures. Thanks. Questions?
It seemed pretty, as you were speaking, it kind of made it clear that right now with technology, we seem to be polarized between what we believe to be a small group of producers and a very big group of consumers. And you always hear this, right? Are you consumer or producer? For mobile devices, producer, consumer. Yet tinkerers exist right there in the middle because it's stuff that they do. So Arduino kind of fits in right there. We think maybe when BASIC first came out on the computers, you could tinker without needing to get a computer science degree, right? So
That's right.
Where are your sense on the way, even with Microsoft and Apple, right, and Google in many ways, all being guilty of this, where we've too polarized it between, well, it's a consumption device, this ability to tinker virtually, you referenced it, but you didn't go too much into that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because to me, that's the key right there, is we tend to over-engineer, and we love as engineers to tinker, but then we want to give a solution that prevents them from tinkering. So they can say, hey, we want a great sketch pad,
Right.
and then we will quickly say, well, with developer dollars, what picture are you going to use for that sketch pad? Because we can give you a canvas of a still life and a canvas of a portrait. We'll even draw in the lines, and you just fill in the color, right?
Right.
No, we want to create, right? We just don't want to make the paper from scratch. So
Right. No, I think that's a great question and an interesting point, and I think you're right. I mean, when the first iPads came out and the first tablets came out, that was a big criticism, right? Was that these were consumer devices. These were not things that were designed for people to actually create things. But I think that one of the surprising things, and again, I think this is actually a pretty new idea that's only starting to sort of take on steam right now. That I do think manufacturers are somewhat to blame, but by the same token, I think consumers are to blame also, because if you sort of play into the notion of these devices as exactly what they're presented as, which is in some cases a totally sealed up device and something that from a software standpoint is hard to play around with, I think that a lot of people could be turned off. But again, we're Americans. We don't follow rules, do we? not in, just because somebody says don't touch it doesn't mean that we shouldn't touch it. And I think that corporations are changing too. I mean, the notion, and I've heard of Microsoft doing this to some degree. I mean, the idea that software can be designed in a way that people can go in there and try to figure out some things for themselves. I mean, certainly that's from the earliest times of PCs, that was the approach. I mean, I have a relative in my family who's a trained engineer, and the idea that he would actually buy a computer that was done is absurd to him. Of course, he would buy the components and he'll put it together however he wants to put it. All he needs is the shell and the circuit board. So I think a lot of engineers sort of think that way, especially when they're not in the office. But I think it's a matter of changing the focus of how we as a culture think about consuming and what we do with those devices once we're done with them. I mean, that's why, having your kid take apart a toaster is a great activity on a rainy day. Unplug the toaster first, but the idea of understanding, if it's funny because I did this when I took apart my phone to replace the screen. My son kept for weeks afterwards saying, "Can we take apart this phone?" And I said, "Well, we're actually still using that phone, but yeah, we could take it apart when we're not using it anymore." So both in virtual and in physical tinkering, this idea that you can you don't have to follow the instructions. I mean, if you want to use the device the way it was intended, by all means follow the instructions. But I think at this point in our evolution as a high-tech society, we're evolved enough that we can know that it's okay to go into these things and try our own thing. I don't know if that answers the question, but a little bit maybe. Any other questions?
I work in our packaging group, and I work with people all over the globe.
Yeah.
Almost every day I'm talking to somebody somewhere, and using technology is just really helpful in that. And you talk a lot about tinkerers, and a lot of people view them as people that are kind of in isolation, in their own little world, or a pocket of people in their own little part of the world.
Right.
How do you see technology really helping change that game and mixing and bringing ideas from all over? Like, what kinds of tools do you think are going to evolve out of that?
Well, I think that, as I referred to before, I mean, one obvious way is just the existence of being able to go out and see what other people are doing. Because I think you touched on something key there because, there's this classic notion as the tinker being this sort of isolated person trying to figure out who knows what. But of course, collaboration can be a very important part of tinkering. And so, these days there are all sorts of message boards online, and there are all sorts of how-to videos and et cetera. So there's that aspect of it. I think that, I guess it's all about communication ultimately. And so any device that exists that allows you to communicate with people wherever they are and sort of add those ideas into your ideas is ultimately going to push towards that next level. And so I think that, I think tinkerers don't have to be isolated in the way that they've been sort of portrayed in the past. And I think that's why you're seeing this manifestation in a lot of these more public activities for tinkerers, because it's kind of a mindset I think that we need to adopt as a culture as much as we do individuals. And ultimately, I think new products will come out of that. Yes?
So one of the things we have here at Microsoft is theater troupe, and I'm involved in that. And it's a community theater, so we end up building the sets and making the costumes and doing all that kind of thing.
Yep.
And it's interesting because we find that there's a lot of people who come volunteer to help and have never actually made anything with their hands. Like they've never held a drill, screwdriver, that, unless it maybe a little IKEA here and there. But other than that,
right.
And we love to get more people involved because they come back and they're like, oh, so I think about things differently now because I can translate from here to here. Do you have any data, or are there any research that you've seen that show that tinkering in the real world, tinkering with your hands, can actually help expand creativity or innovation or anything like that?
I don't have any specific research, although I'd love to know if there is any specific research, because I haven't, I mean, I certainly did look. I can say from my own personal experience, as somebody who tends to sit in front of a computer screen for many, many hours at a time, that I find that I personally, whether it's cooking or anything that getting your hands on is sort of a real release, and and relieves mental stress, I would say. So I mean, I'm a big proponent of activities like that. Are you aware of any?
Yeah, that's what I would love to. People here love data. I'd love to be able to make their own data. Hey, come help us because this will help you be more creative and innovative in your jobs. Because nobody has a lot of spare time, so I can, hey, you'll do something in your spare time that'll actually help your work life too.
Right.
Better chance of winning. Right.
Yeah, it's a tricky, it's a little bit of a catch-22 sometimes, because when you sort of recommend to people to do certain things, sometimes that takes the fun out of it. I did a lot of theater when I was in high school, so I don't need to be sold the merits of it, but it's, I guess it's a communication issue, and I'm trying to think of what kind of data you would be able to gather together to show that. I mean, it may be more like some academic research relating to how kids ultimately develop, but it's I would imagine the benefit. I mean, as you said, everybody who does it likes it, right? So.
All, that's anecdotal.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, maybe we need to, as a culture, be more influenced by anecdotal evidence.
I would say the fact that, by being exposed to other things, I may view a problem as saying, hey, I have a hammer, let's throw a hammer at it, where someone's like, no, we actually need a screwdriver.
Right.
But all I've ever been exposed to is a hammer.
Right.
So by branching out, you learn different ways to attack a problem.
Right.
That would be how I would actually put it.
Okay.
Or educational kinesiology, where physical activity helps them, because not everybody has the ability of moving a left brain problem to the right brain, turning it around, and coming back. There would be research in that regard in terms of physical activities that then help stimulate myelinating the axons in the corpus callosum.
I believe you.
Let's take one more question so we have time for signing.
Great.
Sure. We seem to be in a growing era of more and more people being involved in tinkering.
Right.
And how much of that do you see is really the emergence of different kits and other things that really hold fast all these other degrees of freedom and limit it to, oh, you can change this particular area and you don't have to know the deep electronics part, Arduino, or some of these other things.
Right.
I'm involved in some robotics hobbyists here at Microsoft, and they often said, oh well, when you get into robotics, you're either good at the mechanical part, you're good at the electrical part, or you're good at the computer process, sensory processing software aspect of it.
Right.
And so you usually get good at one of the others, and so it seems to me that more and more of the tinkerers are being exposed to learning how to do whole new things by basically being able to adjust this one lever over here and then realizing, oh, that was pretty cool, let me learn to adjust the lever over there. Do you see that?
Yeah, I understand. Well, I see what you're saying a little bit, because there's this idea of, you're moving out in some area, but already people become specialists again, right? They're good at one particular thing, but you're right. There's probably some additional value to be had in trying to figure out some of the parts you're not as good at, and in fact, maybe taking that part that you're good at and applying it somewhere totally different that may realize something else. I mean, it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to create all kinds of robots that have never been done before, or you're trying to recreate existing types. I mean, I think there's a lot of even you see this at the maker fairs too. I mean, for whatever reason, robots have become the kind of talisman for the maker fairs. I mean, there are a lot of robot activities going on, and I think it. But I think the notion of what that means in a larger context is evolving, and so I think that I would encourage all of those specialists to become generalists a little bit more.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, guys.